Now, from the Pope John Paul II Cultural Center in Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome to a very special edition of The World Over Live. This week, the bishops of the United States held their fall meeting in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, over the next hour, we'll bring you a full recap and analysis of the proceedings, all the major issues, the big speeches, and the stunning upsets. Joining me for this wrap of the bishops' fall meeting, I'm joined on set by Msgr Stuart Swetland, the professor of Christian ethics at Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsburg, Maryland. Monsignor, thanks so much for being with us, as always.
Good to be with you, Raymond.
Good to be with you this week, and we will share much with the folks at home. As you may have noticed, EWTN carried a feed of the Bishops' Conference Open Sessions live, without commentary, earlier this week. However, Msgr Swetland and I were present throughout the conference on site, and will offer you some observations and background information. We also have some exclusive interviews we'll share with you throughout the show. If you have questions or comments about anything you see tonight, drop us an email. We're at worldover@EWTN.com. Let's get to the big story of this conference, the elections held on day 2 of this meeting. Cardinal George has fulfilled his 3-year term as conference president, so elections had to be held for a new president. Now, according to conference tradition, the vice president normally ascends to the office of president. In this case, that would have meant Bishop Gerald Kikanis would have become president. Then the elections came. 10 candidates were included on the ballot, including Bishop Kikanis. Once again, the bishop's notorious electronic voting system was employed. First, they tried a few test votes.
Practice 1, as you can see on the screen. Please indicate your status by voting 1 for the Latin Church if you are Latin Church diocesan bishop, 2 Latin auxiliary.
Are you ready? Oh, there it is. Are you ready? Okay. Mm-hmm. All right.
So,
okay.
The second practice, the question is, will you play golf between now and the end of the year? Please vote 1 for yes, 2 for no. Is there a 3? Okay, so don't mention it. If we could close the vote and project the vote.
No. That's an interesting.
Then the testing completed, they moved on to the big vote for president of the conference. The question was called. The bishops typed in their votes. And...
So as you can see from the results, no. What?
You need to project the results.
You need to project the results.
After several misfires, the final results were projected.
Archbishop Dolan, our new president.
Monsignor, this clearly was the big news of this conference. Timothy Dolan being elected president of this conference, the vivacious, gregarious, engaging Archbishop of New York. What does it mean?
Well, first of all, it was the first time, I think, that a such election was actually carried by the secular press as a breaking news.
Yeah.
And it was above the fold front page news for the New York Times, obviously their Archbishop having been elected. But it also was precedent-setting, and I think really speaks to the fact that bishops want a very visible, a very well-spoken, a very media-savvy, and also someone in a prominent position to be their leader for the next 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about what this means in the larger context historically. I mean, when I spoke to several of these bishops following the vote, some of them couldn't believe it. They didn't realize how numerous their numbers were. We have to remember, going back a few years, you had folks like Archbishop Chaput getting 4 votes, 6 votes, 10 votes, hardly a majority of this conference. Now it seems that a more traditional Orthodox bishop, brand of bishop, the John Paul II bishop, has sort of taken hold in this conference. Some were describing this as a seismic shift, and one bishop told me, we have witnessed the end of the Bernardine era. What do you think that means?
Well, there could be a link, the Chicago link. Obviously, Bishop Kicanis was a priest of Chicago and an auxiliary bishop in Chicago and now is bishop in Tucson. I think that now all of the bishops have been really appointed by John Paul II or by Benedict. There has been a shift in generation.
Yeah.
Many of these bishops know Archbishop Dolan as rector of their seminary. Right. And so there's personalities involved. I don't think a matter of, I think all the bishops are, in the sense of the major teachings of the church, Orthodox, of course, there are bishops. So it comes down now to what kind of style they want to see in their leadership. And I think they very much, in Cardinal George and now Archbishop Dolan, want to put forward a style of leadership that's very visible and able to communicate at the highest level.
And we have to also remind people, this was a pretty slim margin. This was on the 3rd vote. There were 3 votes taken, and in the last ballot, it came down to Archbishop Dolan and Bishop Kicanis. Dolan won the vote, 128 to 111.
Right.
That's a pretty tight margin.
Right. If you do the math, it's 54-46. And I think the conference, to a large extent, is split along that kind of lines about what kind of personality they want leading them. Bishop Kicanis was a fine man. I know him personally. He very much would have paid attention to the minutia of the conference running. Bishop Dolan is going to be more of an outspoken, more of an external-looking leader who will communicate what the bishops are thinking and saying as a collective.
There's also that kind of joyful, what I call vibrant orthodoxy that Dolan epitomizes, I think, for so many people. He's jolly, he's fun, he's very direct, he speaks to every man, and yet, you know, all of the externals are sometimes, they sometimes belie the great learning, his understanding of history and theology that he brings to the game. So this is going to be a very interesting tenure.
It's interesting. We have someone who has a PhD in history as the new conference leader.
Let's talk about these other elections quickly. Archbishop Joseph Kurtz of Louisville, Kentucky, named the vice president of the conference. Another very Orthodox bishop, a solid citizen, and I think in that Dolan model in many ways.
Well, I think the bishops were very impressed with his presentation the day before on the efforts of the bishop to defend the traditional understanding of marriage.
Which we'll hear later.
Right. And that, in many sense, it wasn't a campaign speech, but it put him very prominent on the minds of the bishops, and I think they rewarded his efforts in that area with the vice presidency.
And another quick rundown of some election results. Bishop Michael Bransfield of Wheeling, Charleston, West Virginia. He is the new treasurer of the USCCB, a familiar face to many of those who watched our coverage of the Shrine all those years when he was the rector of the Shrine here in Washington, D.C. Timothy Broglio, the Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Military Services. He will be on the head of the Canonical Affairs and Church Governance Committee. Bishop Joseph McFadden of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He'll be running the Catholic Education Committee for the bishops. Bishop Dennis Madden will be head of the Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs. And Archbishop Edwin O'Brien, International Justice and Peace Committee. Bishop Kicanis has been named head of Catholic Relief Services, which incidentally Archbishop Dolan was chairman of before becoming president.
Right, and Bishop Bransfield will take over immediately as treasurer because Archbishop Kurtz moved up from treasurer to vice president. So a little shuffling of the positions and sharing of the leadership.
Yeah. Now I want to share with you the first glimpse the press got, anyway, of the new president of the conference, Archbishop Timothy Dolan. Here's a bit of that presser. Take a look.
Archbishop Dolan, what would be your chief priorities in the next 3 years as president of the conference, in the church and in society?
Candidly, I haven't had time to think about it. I was surprised about the election, very honored, very flattered, very grateful for the trust of my brother bishops. But I haven't had time to think about it. Now, that having been said, I have such immense regard for my predecessor, Cardinal George, and the men who have preceded him, that I think I can safely say, since I've been part of it as a bishop, that probably my major priority would be to continue with all the vigor I can muster what's already in place. And we bishops, and thank God I got a vice president like Archbishop Kurtz, because you've been very much involved in the strategic pastoral plan for the future of the conference. And I think, Jerry, just to promote that as energetically as I can. So it's not like, thanks be to God, we're in crisis. It's not like, all of a sudden we need some daring new initiatives. No. Thank God for the leadership of Cardinal Francis George. Things are going well. And just to be able to continue that, to work as hard as he did, I think that would probably be my major priority. Okay.
If I can address a specific issue, healthcare, which has
Sure.
been a real, a difficult issue for the bishops in the past year, and continues to be an issue, specifically the question of the possible federal funding of abortion and the healthcare reform. What would be your approach to that issue?
Well, for one, I now doubly, since I've just now that I'm inheriting his position, I am highly appreciative of the summary that Cardinal Francis George gave yesterday, which I thought was downright eloquent when he kind of went over the whole healthcare debate. And I admire the way he handled it. I wouldn't expect that you'd see any surprises. The bishops of the United States are in somewhat of a delicate position, in that for 9 decades we've been on the forefront of promoting comprehensive health care. On the other hand, at a time when we should have been doing cartwheels because we're close to it, we found ourselves with some rather grave reservations for fear that the health care plan was unfortunately not comprehensive, namely that there was a significantly precious part of people deserving of protection in health care, namely the unborn baby, that were in danger, perhaps, of being excluded. So I think under Cardinal George, I think under the leadership of this conference, the bishops were rather cogent in expressing both of those poles, which put us in a bit of a delicate in a delicate position. Cardinal George was so, I think, articulate yesterday in reminding us what Pope John Paul II used to say, that although we're political in the best sense of the word, the way Aristotle would define it, as politics being a very noble call to serve the human community, but we're not partisan. John Paul II was always very precise in separating being political, which all of us need to be. That's a noble vocation. And partisan. The bishops of the United States are not partisan politicians. We're pastors and we're teachers.
Well, you heard Archbishop Dolan there. There was something you wanted to pick up on that you heard in that press conference. 2 words,
continuity and vigor. Continuity with what Cardinal George has been doing in the last 3 years in being that outspoken, that spokesperson for the bishops, and the vigor. Archbishop Dolan brings that very large vigor that he has, that large heart, that large mind, to the task.
Archbishop Dolan referenced his predecessor, Cardinal Francis George. It was Cardinal George's, the end of his tenure as president, and he offered an insightful and impassioned final presidential address, which touched on everything from health care reform to the horrible fallout from the war in Iraq. Take a look.
During this past year, the USCCB has been partner to the public debate on health care law. Our voice was that of the bishops of our country for the past 100 years. In a good society, everyone should be cared for, especially the poor. The goal of basic health care for all continues to be a moral imperative not yet reached, but it is not now and has not been up to the bishops to decide the means to realize that goal. We have only very cautiously entered into the details of public policy, for this is more properly the work of lay people, as it has been in the healthcare debate. But once political leaders and healthcare experts decided to use government-subsidized insurance as the vehicle, the means for providing more universal health care, it was our moral obligation as teachers of the faith to judge whether the means passed moral muster, whether or not the proposed legislation used public funds to kill those living in their mother's womb. Consistently, and ever more insistently, Since the sin and crime of abortion was legalized in the United States, our voice has been that of the bishops of the Catholic Church ever since the first Christians condemned the abortion practices of the ancient Romans. The act is immoral, and the laws that have permitted now 50 million children of our country to be killed in their mother's womb are also immoral and unjust. The laws are destroying our society. The debate made clear, to me at least, that at a certain point, there were those who started with the faith in its integrity, in all its demands, and fit their political choices into the context of the fullness of the Church's teaching. And there were those for whom a political choice, even a very good choice, was basic, and the Church was judged useful by whether or not she provided foot soldiers for their political commitment, whether the left or the right. For too many, politics is the ultimate horizon of their thinking and acting. As we know, fidelity to Christ in his body, the Church, calls for two responses on the part of those who would call themselves his disciples: orthodoxy in belief and obedience in practice. In 1990, then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger quoted now blessed John Henry Newman that, quote, "The whole duty and work of a Christian is made up of these two parts, faith and obedience, looking into Jesus, Hebrews 2, and acting according to his will," end of quote. Orthodoxy is necessary but not enough. The devil is orthodox. He knows the catechism better than anybody in this room, but he will not serve. He will not obey. There can be mistakes in our thinking, but there can be no self-righteousness in our will, for this is the sin against the Holy Spirit. We should not fear political isolation. The Church has often been isolated in politics and in diplomacy. But we need to be deeply concerned about the wound to the Church's unity that has been inflicted in this debate, and I hope, trusting in the goodwill of all concerned, that means can be found to restore the seamless garment of ecclesial communion. Ever since the capture of Baghdad, it has been clear to anyone of goodwill that while Muslim groups might be in conflict with one another, it was uniquely the Christians who were without protection in the wake of our country's invasion of Iraq. Now, at the end of last month, on the vigil of the Feast of All Saints, in the Syriac Catholic Cathedral of Our Lady of Deliverance in the city of Baghdad, many dozens of Catholics were killed as they gathered for Mass. Two were priests. One was killed at the altar, and the other as he left the confessional. They are joined in death with hundreds of others who have died for their faith in Christ since the conquest of Iraq by our country. An American Dominican sister, a friend of a friend, has written from that country, quote, "Waves of grief have enveloped their world, surging along the fault lines created in Iraqi society by the displacement of thousands of Iraq's Christian minority who have fled what is clearly a growing genocidal threat. One survivor was asked by a reporter, 'What do you say to the terrorists?' Through his tears, he said, 'We forgive you.' Among the victims of this senseless tragedy was a little boy named Adam. 3-year-old Adam witnessed the horror of dozens of deaths, including that of his own parents. He wandered among the corpses and the blood, following the terrorists around and admonishing them, 'Enough, enough, enough.' According to witnesses, this continued for 2 hours until Adam was himself murdered." End of quote. As bishops, as Americans, we cannot turn from this scene or allow the world to overlook it. Dear brothers, we have all experienced challenges and even tragedies that tempt us to say at times, enough. Yet all of our efforts, our work, our failures, our sense of responsibility pale before the martyrdom of our brothers and sisters in Iraq and the active persecution of Catholics in other parts of the Middle East, in India and Pakistan, in China and in Vietnam, in Sudan and African countries rent by civil conflict. With their faces always before us, we stand before the Lord, collectively responsible for all those whom Jesus Christ died to save. And that is more than enough to define us as bishops and to keep us together in mission. May the Lord, during these days, give us vision enough to see what he sees and strength enough to act as he would have us act, and that will be enough. Thank you.
Monsignor, I remember when Cardinal George was offering this address, I saw you feverishly writing in the corner there. Well, what stood out for you there?
Well, all of us preachers steal, and there was a great line. I love how he talked about the poor as the first citizens in the kingdom of Christ. An important point to be made, and especially how he put the vulnerable, including the unborn, as among the poor, and the way that was all inclusive. And then the very powerful ending where he spoke impassionately in defense of the Iraqi Christians who are under threat.
Absolutely. And a little later, we'll share with you Cardinal George's letter, a letter he wrote to President Obama about the tragic state of Christians in Iraq. And again, that'll be coming up shortly. Msgr Swetland, what did you make finally of this final address? He has such a way, Cardinal George, of kind of telescoping a moment and presenting it in a cogent and clear way.
Just in one line, saying so much, where he talked about Dorothy Day and John Courtney Murray coming together, in the sense that people from which were politically you might consider more conservative and more liberal or even radical in Dorothy Day's case, yet now as Catholics, the issues that bring us together because of the countercultural witness we must be to a culture that's becoming more and more not in tune with the gospel. There's a certain unity coming about. And even though we have differences internally, we are united on so much as we have to stand against a culture which is, in many ways, falling apart.
Well, in some ways, I see the election of Archbishop Dolan is the coming together. It's the end of the seamless garment sort of nonsense that was perpetuated for so long in the Church. It is no longer do we have to pit the social justice teachings of the Church against the moral teachings of the Church. They are one and should be one. And that's what I think we're hearing more and more from all of these bishops, but particularly the leaders at this conference.
Right, and the seamless garment, what you just described, really is a seamless garment.
Right.
It may be a bigger garment than people thought, and it will go against the misuse of that term.
Right.
If anyone has read Cardinal Bernardine's original use of it, it was just that the moral and the social come together because it's one witness to Jesus Christ.
Right. The problem, I think, was the way that term was used over the last decades to somehow divorce the moral teaching from the embrace of certain social programs. And this was even a debate at this conference, which we heard when the Catholic Campaign for Human Development came up. Now, that organization has been besieged by controversy over the last few years, owing to its funding of left-wing organizations like ACORN and other organizations who actually work in opposition to church teaching. This year, the Bishops' Committee that oversees the CCHD has promised a review and renewal of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. Here is Bishop Roger Moran of Biloxi. He's head of the CCHD subcommittee.
The review and renewal of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development does three fundamental things. It reaffirms CCHD's Catholic foundations and priority for the poor. It responds to concerns about some CCHD funding practices, and it makes 10 commitments to strengthen CCHD as a faithful and effective expression of Catholic social and moral teaching and the gospel. Our work is not done. We will be responding to the suggestions voiced earlier today in the regional meetings and in further discussions to come. The concerns expressed this morning reflect the specific new directions that are outlined in the report. Those directions, as part of the commitment to renewal, are to give priority to the participation of Catholic parishes and parishioners, pastors, religious and diocesan leaders, and Catholic institutions in CCHD's work. The direction is to better ensure that CCHD funds will not be used to support any activity which conflicts with fundamental Catholic moral and social teaching, particularly human life and dignity, marriage and family, and our abiding priority to serve the least of these among us.
Well, there you have Bishop Morin commenting on this very contentious organization, which is under the auspices of the Bishops' Conference. In recent years, the bishops have been very vocal in their displeasure with some of the reports leaking out to the press and elsewhere where monies were used to fund organizations that were supporting abortion, gay marriage, the whole 9 yards, while at the same time they're mounting efforts to put down abortion and gay marriage. So it was sort of conflicting goals here, purportedly to aid and help those in poverty. Your thoughts on what we heard?
Well, I think what should be emphasized is they are very sincere in trying to get this right. It's a work in progress. Professor Mingling, or pardon me, Father Mingling, who is my teacher and is my dean now at the seminary, is a wonderful man, and I know already they've begun working on this renewed process. You know, the CCHD, I used to be a local diocesan representative. You know, it required the local bishop to sign off on everything. But now they're asking more specific questions to help the bishop make a better decision. And I saw it do a lot of good for poor people, especially in areas which are underfunded by the government. So I hope that we can see CCHD now become what it advertises itself to be. Not a handout, but a hand up for people who need it the most, and based on our Catholic principles, all of our Catholic principles. Right. And I think they're very sincere in their attempt to reform this.
And there's a clear change in policy here. But for the first time, really, it is making Catholic entities available for funding via the CCHD, which is a major turn of events. And again, having a theologian, a moral theologian, on staff to evaluate these proposals, one hopes this will rectify some of the, some of the difficulties that have plagued it in recent years.
And they're doing some practical things, like they're going to limit the number that they fund, because that way they'll be able to analyze them more closely.
And now, but at the same time, you've got 10 bishops plus who are not allowing the collection for CCHD in their dioceses because they feel they can't control where this money is going. They're a little concerned about it. Do you think this will allay those fears?
Time will tell.
Yeah.
Time will tell. But it's interesting. It's a good lesson in ecclesiology that the local bishop still is the shepherd for his local church. And that while the conference does things collectively, the local shepherd still has the last word.
I heard from a few bishops that in some of the regional meetings, and they informed Bishop Morin, that they would like to see the CCHD sunsetted so that it would sort of go out of existence and those monies could be used for something else. They were proposing things like Catholic education, which always made sense to me. I mean, if you really want to help the poor, is there no better way? Is there a better way to improve their lives than by giving them a Catholic education, by shaping them both morally and intellectually? And that's a convincing argument to me, at least.
Right. And there were those are all off the record officially, but they're in the regional discussions. Some bishops told me there's discussion about perhaps changing the way the formula for the collection goes. Currently, 75% of it goes to the national collection and 25% stays locally. There's some discussion perhaps that would be better to change that formula.
Reversing. Well, we'll keep watching this. This is fascinating, the way this CCHD reform has happened over the last few years, and we'll keep watching it. The USCCB budget is always an interesting discussion point, and this year was no exception. The bishop's budget is increasing 24%. Owing to an increase in federal grants for migration and refugee services. Now, how much of this budget is related to federal income, Monsignor?
If you look at the entire budget, half of it really is, even more so. The two biggest chunks is the programs they do in cooperation with the federal government, especially in the area of migrants and in refugees, and in the national collections that are taken up for the various activities, Church in Eastern Europe, Retired Religious, CCHD. These national collections, of course, are a huge chunk of the monies that the conference is involved with. This year, that went up significantly because of the wonderful and huge generosity of the of Catholics in America in response to the crisis in Haiti and the earthquake relief. So there is this huge increase due to more work with the government in the area of refugees and migrants, and in the increase in the generosity of American Catholics to help in those special collections.
And what are we talking about? A $19 million increase in that federal grant money?
Yes, $19 million.
For the Refugee and Migration Services. Right. But is there some concern, Monsignor, when you have a religious entity, essentially a religious bureaucracy, that is so dependent on, and people who work over there have told me, work at the Bishops' Conference, that this is how we pay the bills and keep the doors open, keep the electricity on. It's via this federal largesse. Is there a danger regarding the mission of an organization when it is so tethered financially to the federal government?
Well, we do certain things very well as a church, and the federal government has recognized this. This is part of going back. This is very bipartisan because let's go back to the faith-based initiatives to a large extent, and continues with the current administration. The idea that we're better at helping people on the ground. And so the money, yes, comes through the conference, but a lot of it goes to the local areas to help people in real need. So I would rather see that money coming through the conference, who I think does a very good job of being good stewards of that, and really are helping serve people that no one else is serving.
Related to this discussion was the issue of assessments. Now, that's the amount each diocese pays to this national conference, essentially a portion of your money. The Budget Committee proposed a 3% increase. Some bishops took issue with that proposed increase. Take a look.
Archbishop Chaput first, please. Two things. I'd like to remind the body that anytime we vote to increase our assessment to the conference, we also vote to increase our assessment to the Holy See, because we bound ourselves that the assessment amount for the conference would be the same amount that we send to the Holy Father. I'm very happy to do that, but I just want to remind us, so 3% really means 6% in terms of our coming up with new money. Since you've done so well in the budget, I don't know why you're asking for an increase. If I tried to do that in my diocese, my pastors would be very unhappy. Yeah. And, this past 2 years, our Diocesan campaign has not reached its goal. The amount of money made in collections to our parishes is less than it was. Since we're doing so well, I don't see any need for us to have any increase at all in the assessment.
Yeah. Archbishop Chaput, thank you. Allow me to respond a little bit from the sense of the Budget and Finance Committee. First of all, we are projecting into the near future. And one of the struggles that we have as a conference right now is our capacity to be able to fund new initiatives. Those new initiatives are coming from the body. Most of them are coming either from outside sources or from the general fund. And so we fear that there will be an erosion of the support from that comes from the assessments if over time we don't prudently increase the amount.
Cardinal DiNardo.
You mentioned earlier to Archbishop Chaput about the prudential judgment that you made. So therefore, they did not think the prudential judgment should be 2%, but 3%.
No, the committee didn't, although I can understand.
Because it makes a difference on some of these figures here if you run them through on individual dioceses.
It would approximately, it would be a difference of an increase instead, about 2/3 of the increased amount would be present. So a diocese that would be giving, let's say $600 would be giving $400 instead.
Sure, but as you say, given the variations in the country of some larger places, it's actually even at 2% would be more than 2%. And this shows through in some of the figures. I'm just wondering how, obviously you have to do something more general, but the difference of 2% and 3%, at least in a local church, I can't speak for someone else, is significant in terms of payment.
Yes.
Bishop Brom?
I want to ask if any consideration has been given to dioceses suffering seriously because of extraordinary global settlement agreements that had to be reached. I might quote Bishop Tom Curry to say that in most of the dioceses of California, the results have been devastating and long range. Speaking for myself, we've paid down from 80-some million to 50-some million, but there's still 50-some million to go.
Yeah.
The question is, have we taken into account what's happened in this country, and in some parts more than others?
Yes.
The judge that we think ruled improperly regarding the challenge to 1776 said, well, if the mission of the church goes on as usual, obviously the church hasn't been targeted. Well, we're giving the impression that the mission of the church is going on as usual to some degree. I know there's been tightening in the USCCB offices as well as dioceses. But the impression is still out there that the judge is right. Business as usual.
The bishops finally decided to not increase the diocesan assessment for all of 2011. Msgr Swetland, where was this money going?
It was across the budget, the 3%. Now they'll have to go back without the 3% increase and redo the budget. One thing I think will be lost, there was a provision for a very small pay raise for some of the people who work at the conference. That may have to be revisited. I don't know. I don't do that work. But it was very interesting. I did hear one bishop who will remain nameless say, in reference to the voting on the presidency and the voting on not having an increase, that they had their own little tea party on Tuesday morning.
The own Tea Party movement.
The own Tea Party movement there. And I think it is a reflection that the bishops are saying, wait a minute, maybe we need to keep more resources close to home and not as many in Washington. This is like what's going on in the country. Well, this question of solidarity, but also subsidiarity.
Look, I think it's very refreshing, and I'm sure people at home agree, to hear a bishop take to the floor and say, wait a minute here. What about what's happening in the rest of the country? Are you totally unaware of that? This is a good thing to hear. And, we haven't heard this sort of discussion in the bishops' conference. So it was refreshing, I thought.
I think it's important to say, though, that I did some math after the fact, and most individual Catholics are contributing. It's a pittance, really. In my own diocese, it's about 25 cents per Catholic is being contributed to the national. In a bigger diocese where there's economies of scale, it's more like 10 cents a Catholic. So it's not a huge amount. Right. And they're getting a lot, if you will, to use an expression, a lot of bang for their buck, in the sense that the conference does a lot. But still, the local church is saying, wait a minute, I was saying to you, we could count this in terms of CCD teachers or DREs or youth ministers. Each diocese, even a small diocese, is sending the equivalent of a youth minister's position to the national
The salary
conference.
that would be involved in hiring and retaining a youth minister in the diocese.
And the bigger dioceses are sending a dozen or 10. And that's how I think bishops are looking at it and saying, perhaps I could use some of that money better at home.
Back home, yeah, really interesting. The head of the Bishops' Pro-Life Committee, Cardinal Daniel DiNardo of Galveston, Houston, asked the bishops to authorize the draft of a new document on physician-assisted suicide. We spoke to him about the proposal.
Since Oregon passed a law for physician-assisted suicide, for many years, that was the only state that had it. But now Washington has. Then we had a very troubling development. The Supreme Court in Montana issued a ruling that, in fact, physician-assisted suicide is not excluded by the Constitution in the state of Montana. And what we are watching is the Northwest and the plan of those groups who are very intent on getting physician-assisted suicide are moving from the Northwest, and they want to go to California and then across the nation. We've also had a couple of troubling comments in Vermont, for instance, where the new governor has made it a priority to work for a law for physician-assisted suicide. For all these reasons, Raymond, the Pro-Life Committee became very persuaded at the end of the summer that we needed as a conference to move forward and to give some direction, catechesis, but also some momentum to those groups for disabilities, groups that are pro-life, that are most concerned about this movement of
What would you like people to do with regard to this issue? What do you want Catholics watching to do?
Well, first of all, if there's ever a time for voting, we want them to be careful to make sure they understand the importance of this issue. If there's a ballot initiative concerning it. But we need our Catholics to be attentive to why the Church understands the grave danger of someone who is ill, someone who might think themselves useless, that in our eyes, in God's eyes, and in the eyes of the civic society, they are of infinite worth. You don't solve your problem by killing people. That's the issue.
Cardinal DiNardo's proposal was accepted by the bishops. Monsignor, given how quickly this issue is progressing of suicide and assisted suicide, the bishops may have to write another document about family-assisted suicide in that they often have competency and control over the morphine in a hospice situation and sometimes in a home situation. And with the financial incentives now in place, I'm sure this will be the next horizon for the bishops on this issue.
Well, this shows why we need a national conference, how quickly they are responding. And this is a change, too. It used to take years to develop these. Because, look at it, a state court somewhere, in this case Montana, decides that there's a fundamental right to suicide, to physician-assisted suicide. Now we're seeing the same kind of movement. And the bishops are responding on a national level, saying this can't just be a local issue for Montana or for the Northwest. We all have to worry about this. And it is a sad time. So break of solidarity with those most vulnerable, that there would be the idea that the art and the craft of medicine, which is meant to build up life, would be turned to serve death. That would be a terrible move in our society.
Yeah. We'll leave it there for a moment. As we said earlier, EWTN aired this fall conference of the bishops free of commentary. We beamed it into every diocese in the U.S. live. And this program can be seen in all of our 148 million households around the globe, not counting the 100-plus AM/FM affiliates around the country that run the show. Here's a gracious thank you from the Bishops' Conference to those who broadcast coverage of this fall meeting in its entirety.
I would like to say also a word of gratitude to Telecare TV. Our public sessions have again been broadcast and webcasted through the generosity and professional work of Telecare TV, a ministry of the Rockville Center Diocese in New York. In collaboration with the USCCB Communications Department, our sessions have been broadcast in approximately 30 dioceses and distributed on the internet around the world. Thank you to Bishop Murphy for providing your staff and their expertise at the service of the conference.
When we return, more on this 2010 fall meeting of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Our World Over Live wrap continues. Stay with us.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to the World Over Live, our recap of the 2010 fall meeting of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops continues. I'm joined on set by Msgr Stuart Swetland. He's the professor of Christian ethics at Mount St. Mary's University. Msgr, it's always great to have you with us. As we alluded to earlier, outgoing President Cardinal George wrote a letter to President Barack Obama about the terrible situation facing Christians in Iraq. Here he is reading a bit of that letter.
Dear Mr. President, the October 31st attack on the Syrian Catholic Cathedral in Baghdad that killed 58 and wounded 75, together with the recent wave of bombings in Iraq's capital, are grim evidence of the savage violence and lack of security that has plagued the Iraqi people, especially Christians and other minorities, for over 7 years. Some reports even indicate that the October 31st attack may have been more extensive and the failures of security more egregious than originally thought. Enclosed, you will find a press release by the Most Reverend Yosef Habash, Bishop of the Eparchy of Our Lady of Deliverance of Newark, for Syrian Catholics. In the recent Synod of Bishops on the Middle East in Rome, the bishops from Iraq spoke of the terrifying situation facing Christians and other minorities in that country. They recalled murders, kidnappings, bombings, and naked threats that have forced many Christians from their homes and businesses. Ironically, just 2 weeks before the October 31st attack, Archbishop Athanase Mati Shaba Matoka of the Syrian Catholic Church in Iraq, whose cathedral was the site of the October 31st attack, addressed the Synod in Rome. Quote, "The invasion of Iraq by America and its allies brought to Iraq in general and especially to its Christians destruction and ruin on all levels. 7 years have passed and Christianity is still bleeding. Where is the world conscience? All the world remains a spectator before what is happening in Iraq, especially with regards to Christians." End of quote. Archbishop Matoka's strong words remind us of the moral responsibility that the United States bears for working effectively with the Iraqi government to stem the violence. Having invaded Iraq, our nation has a moral obligation not to abandon those Iraqis who cannot defend themselves. The murderous attack on innocent Christians gathered for worship witnesses to the need for the United States to redouble its efforts to assist Iraq as our engagement enters a new phase. Bishop Tobin?
The only comment I would have about the letter, and I know that it's already been sent and it cannot be changed and edited, is that without the whole background, someone just reading the letter itself might come away with the impression that the United States alone or the United States military is responsible for all of the violence that has taken place there and the unintended consequences and so forth. I know that's not the intention. I know that's not what's being said, but in the press release that accompanied the letter, we do speak about the responsibility of the terrorists who launched these attacks and apparently are responsible for them. But nowhere in the letter itself does that seem to be real clear. I'm sure it's intended, but the emphasis seems to be solely on the intervention of the United States and the unintended consequences and our ongoing responsibility for dealing with that, which we certainly have. I don't think anybody would question that, but seems to gloss over the fact that other individuals, other groups are responsible for the terrible atrocities that have taken place there.
Bishop Tobin, you're entirely correct. It's imposed by the nature of a letter to the President of the United States. He's not responsible for terrorist actions and can't control them. So if we were to issue a more general statement about who is responsible for this entire situation, all the actors that you mentioned would certainly be in it. In this case, it's a letter to our President. It's a letter to him as someone who is responsible for those who still have a presence and an ability to create a better security situation than what we have now.
Monsignor, the administration's appalling lack of attention to this ancient Christian community is really appalling. And I think that's what you hear in Cardinal George's letter. But Bishop Tobin made an interesting point there, that by not mentioning the terrorists, are you somehow implicating the United States and saying they're to blame for everything that's happened on the ground?
Right. And, of course, we heard in the President's address, his farewell address, if you will, Cardinal George's impassioned plea on behalf of the Christians in Iraq. That wonderful statement by one of the survivors that people heard as a reporter asked him, what do we say to the terrorists? And the Christian response, the person said, in the midst of tears, "We forgive you." And the tragic story of that little boy, Adam, going around and saying to them as they were killing, "Enough, enough."
Yep.
And this is what the administration must say: enough killing of innocent Christians. The terrorizing of innocent Christians anywhere, Sudan, Iraq, wherever. If we're not speaking out on behalf of those who are being attacked in genocidal ways, then we're not living up to our obligations internationally.
Archbishop Timothy Broglio of the Military Archdiocese offered a report on the state of his archdiocese and had a request for his brother bishops. He took a moment to brief us, and we asked the Archbishop about his opposition to lifting the ban on gays serving in the military. Take a look.
I think the problem with the change is a forcing of our society to accept something as normal, which is not normal, or is certainly not the norm, and it creates problems. Certainly in the units, it creates problems also in terms of our own preaching of the gospel, because we can be accused of somehow getting in the way of inequality, and it also raises the question of, does everyone have a right to serve, or can there be some distinction between those who serve and those who do not?
Tell me what impact this might have on the chaplains who are merely teaching and echoing church teaching on homosexuality and these other issues.
I think the only impact it could have would be if a chaplain would be preaching about homosexuality as being disordered, that this could be interpreted against him, not in his favor, and that could create a problem.
Tell me, what is happening in the chaplaincy right now? I know you're always looking for new recruits. What have you been hearing and what are you seeing?
We are actually down in numbers. We're down to 275 active duty chaplains. We would need approximately 800 to accomplish the mission effectively. However, any increase would be helpful. If you consider that we're a nation at war on two fronts, obviously the presence of Catholic chaplains is very, very important, and it requires a sacrifice on the part of dioceses and religious orders to give us the priests that we need.
Archbishop, I have spoken to so many priests who've been chaplains, and they talk about how it has deepened and changed their priesthood for the better. Can you speak to that, about the gift of being a chaplain and what one learns from the field about fraternity?
I think one of the primary experiences is the great richness of the people that you work for, because they are very dedicated. They're very much eager to participate in the life of the chapel, and so the chaplain finds his own priesthood reaffirmed by working with these people. And of course, it's also been a tremendous font of vocations. 10% of those ordained in the United States every year are prior military service. Yes.
What are you asking the bishops at this meeting?
I asked each bishop to consider the possibility of giving to the military services one more chaplain, one more priest to serve as a chaplain, and I also asked them to seriously consider setting aside a day of prayer and fasting for world peace and also for an end of the suicides, which have become a tremendous problem among our military.
What did you make of Archbishop Broglio's request to the bishops there?
Well, first, as someone who came into the Catholic Church while he was in the military, who discerned his vocation to the priesthood while serving in the military, I just want to second that we need good, solid, holy priest in the military. I always tell the bishops, if they invest that way, they'll get back many vocations, because there's men and women who will come to figure out that they're called to religious life, that they're called to serve in the priesthood, because they're already serving. They already have that. And they're the best group of people going, the people who are volunteering for our armed services. I would personally like to see a quota system where, based on population, based on your commitment, every diocese is held up and said that's the quota you should have in the military, and it should be known what dioceses aren't fulfilling their quotas.
Sort of a priestly assessment from every diocese.
Right, and in a way also say these are the places that may not be living up to those obligations, because the men and women in the armed services need that commitment.
Yeah, well, I was talking to one of the chaplains. I mean, they are down, they need 800 men. Chaplains, just to match the amount of people serving who are Catholic. And they're just not there. We have a little more, over 100 chaplains. I mean, it's simply not enough. And Protestant ministers are off the charts. They've got more than they can handle. So it's a real need. And, the military archdiocese is calling for help. So I hope they get it.
Well, good news. I'm at Mount St. Mary's University, and I think there's about a dozen men who are already training with the military as well as training with their diocese. So they'll be coming here in the near future.
Yeah, very good news. For years, the bishops have been committed to defending marriage, particularly as it's been challenged all across the U.S. Bishop Joseph Kurtz, the new vice president of the conference, offered a report on the bishop's defense of marriage. Here's what he had to say.
In our nation, we find ourselves at a moment of really great opportunity, but also great consequence. There is a special urgency. The urgency of our priority to promote and protect and strengthen marriage has not abated in this last year. Over the last year, we have seen that attempts to legally redefine or erode the meaning of marriage at a state level now continue to shift to the federal level. And among the federal level attacks, the most worrisome is in the judicial realm, where California's Proposition 8 is being challenged as a violation of the United States Constitution. If that challenge ultimately succeeds at the Supreme Court, the decision will have a moral, legal, and cultural impact akin to Roe v. Wade in 1973. In a sense, today is like 1970 for marriage. Let me put it another way. If in 1970 you knew that Roe v. Wade were coming in 2 or 3 years, what would you have done differently? And so the vital question to us today, and not only to us but to our country, is what do we do for marriage?
Key question there being raised. Why is this issue so important? Some people look in who are inside and outside of the Catholic Church and they say, this isn't affecting my marriage. This isn't affecting your marriage. If these two people want to go off and call what they have a marriage, what difference does it make, Monsignor?
Well, first level is it's the judicial activism involved. Our democracy is up for grabs if judges can change willy-nilly the meaning of words, the interpretation of law, even overturn duly elected propositions in a state like California. So there's really an anti-democratic flavor to this judicial activism. And it's very dangerous for society to have this kind of legislation from the bench. Second, opposition and the changing in the definition of words. Words have meaning. We believe the Word became flesh. We think words are very important. And to change the meaning of marriage, which has a meaning in law and in fact, about a one-flesh unity of man and woman, to change that to be whatever we want to define it to be means that we can change the meanings of words. And that's very dangerous because what can happen is the meaning of what it means to be a person was changed by Roe versus Wade. And now we see the unborn unprotected. Now we see people who are mentally handicapped or at the end of life being threatened by a change of meaning of words. What's at stake really is fundamental to the fabric of our society.
Finally, there was a proposal before the bishops to recognize the baptisms of certain Reformed Protestant communities. Though other national conferences have accepted such agreements, the U.S. bishops have never done so. Why is the recognition of baptisms of these other communities necessary?
Well, first, it's important to continue our dialogue for the real but imperfect communion we have with other Christian churches. Practically, it's important for conversions. So when we receive someone in the church, do we recognize the baptism as valid, or do we have to conditionally or actually baptize them? And the question of marriage, because when a marriage between a Catholic and a practitioner of one of these denominations, we want to know that it's a sacramental marriage between two baptized persons. So it's important for all those reasons, including the ongoing dialogue between the communities.
I want to just step back for a moment. We were together for the 2 days of this conference. What lingers most in your memory? What will you remember of this particular Bishops' Fall meeting?
Well, you know, we've been doing this for a while, and we saw something unprecedented. It was a real sea change in the way the bishops said in their election of Archbishop Dolan and in their overturning of the recommendation of their own subcommittee on finances about an increase in the subsidies. It's no longer business as usual. The bishops' conference, if you will, the people from the floor have taken control of the conference, and that's the way it will be, I think, for the foreseeable future.
Well, Monsignor, I thank you as always for being with us as my co-host, and your insight is always so welcome. So thank you for being here once again.
Thank you.
On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. Thanks for joining us. Bye now.